Northwest Indian Child Welfare Institute at the time. It came out of a desire from tribal leaders here in the Northwest, child welfare directors, and other Native people who were working in state and private services to have an organization that would respond and help tribes and tribal organizations and urban Indian organizations be able to do some of the things that were hard for them to do. So providing basic culturally based research, trying to find and develop trainings that would be responsive to what Native children and families need in community and the workforce in tribal and urban Indian communities. And also to do advocacy work to make sure that policymakers and advocates at the tribal level had the information that they needed to be able to respond and develop good policy and promote more tribal capacity building through additional resources. So our organization has been incorporated and working in Indian country and for a long time. We started in the Northwest, but in 1993, we became the National Indian Child Welfare Association based on the demand and the requests of many tribes around the country. So what we're doing today is part of that work. And I want to also remind people that while we're not asking people to be members to be able to access, we're providing these webinars to whoever wants to be part of them. We are a membership-based organization, and your memberships help us be able to provide this kind of content, these kind of forums. So please, if you have a chance, take a look at our website, look at our membership page, and if you're not already a member, please consider joining NICWA as a member. And for those of you who are members, thank you very much for your membership, and we appreciate your support. So in developing this, COVID-19 webinar, our first two webinars were focused a little bit on sort of the policies and what was in some of the legislation that was providing resources and other kinds of program piece of information. This one is where we're really kind of starting to move into more of the practice realm, and what we thought and what we were hearing around in Indian country and other places was that people wanted to hear from their peers. They wanted to hear from people who were actually on the front lines doing this work, coordinating, managing this work. And so we've developed a panel with 4 panelists. I'm going to be the moderator. And our panelists represent a broad variety of tribes, as well as legal professionals working on ICWA cases in various places, and also national urban Indian organizations or regional urban Indian organizations are also in the urban areas doing this work as well. So I think you're going to enjoy the panel. I wanted to give you here on this slide a little bit of an idea of what kind of questions we asked our panelists. So we asked them about what are the major changes that have occurred because of COVID-19? What are the things that you and others that you're working with are doing to respond to these changes? What's working? What's not working? Where are you getting resources to help, and what resources could you use that you don't have yet? And lastly, do you have any lessons learned or suggestions for others? And I know there are lots of people on the call who are probably looking for some of those lessons learned as well. And as we know in Indian country, we rely heavily on the experiences of each other and the services that we provide to be able to help kind of guide us through these difficult times. So I'm going to start by introducing our first panelist. Excuse me. Our first panelist is Janeen, who lives in Seattle, Washington, and is an enrolled member of the Comenote Indian Nation in Washington State. She's the founding executive director of the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. And this is a national coalition representing 45 urban Indian centers in 32 different cities, and more than 2 million Native people living away from their traditional land base. The National Urban Indian Family Coalition is one of the only national organizations dedicated to making the invisible visible and providing a platform and voice for the underrepresented population in America. So with that, I want to welcome Janeen Comenote, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the experiences that she and some of the other folks from the coalition have experienced.
Thank you, David. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. Again, my name is Janeen Comenote, and I am an enrolled member of the Comenote Indian Nation. Like David said, I live in Seattle, and I'm the executive director of the National Urban Indian Family Coalition. So the coalition was really founded when we realized that there wasn't a unified voice for urban Indian organizations who weren't working in healthcare. And specifically, we started around child welfare and looking at what's going on with our children and families who are living in the cities. And we've grown since then to do a lot of other stuff. But we were founded on child welfare and looking at children. So I'm just going to dive right into this. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we quickly realized at the NUIFC that I'm from Seattle, so we were one of the first cities to shut down. And so I, began looking around at what was going on here in Seattle and realized that this is going to happen in pretty much every city in America. So in March, we really, in late March, starting in March and continuing through early April, we surveyed our 45 urban Indian organizations to find out what effect the shutdown was going to have on the organizations themselves. And what we came up with was that we had 24 cities, 45 organizations participated. Within these 45 organizations, there's a combined budget of 153 million. These organizations employ over 1,500 employees. And this is really significant to us as 1.7 million American Indians live in these 24 metro areas. So the metro areas is the city limits and the surrounding suburbs of that city. When we looked at the population, we realized that 35% of this population is under the age of 18. And as we always do at the NUIFC, we really look at what are our children and families experiencing off the reservation. And we know that our Native children experience poverty at 3 times the rate of white children. And we always bring this up because it's relevant to how these organizations provide services, what kinds of services they provide, and what the quality of life is for our Native people who live in and around these large cities. Can we go to the next slide? So of our 45 member centers, about 80% of them have very specific services for children, youth, and families. Of the 45, 10 of them actually have ICW or ICWA specific programming, which means they're interfacing with all of the local municipalities that they have to work with. For these 10, and that's just the 10 in our circle, there's dozens and dozens more out there in the cities throughout the country. We know that these organizations, much like the tribal welfare, child ICW departments on this call, have to deal with a number of different municipalities. So some of these states are what I call state-based child welfare systems. Some are county-based child welfare systems. And of our centers who work in county-based child welfare systems, which would be California, Colorado, Minnesota. These are all states where the child welfare system is county-based, and often these centers have to work within anywhere between 1 to a dozen counties at any given time for their child welfare services. As you know, one of the things that when I spoke to a few of our different member centers who have ICWA specific programming, one of the things that they all shared was that particularly in county-based systems, that the counties themselves often had different outcomes relating to ICWA and child welfare during the pandemic. But all of them reported that counties were really struggling at the beginning of the shutdown, and I'm sure all of us did, with how to conduct child welfare during shutdown. So court systems were essentially put on hold. Many court systems are still on hold, but they've also seen that active efforts in these specific cases have been really, really slowed down. And that went across the spectrum from county systems and state systems. Other things that they've reported was that they've had to oversee visitations occurring virtually. Related to that, all of our organizations, those with and without child welfare programs, are reporting that the digital divide has been the biggest barrier to being able to do the work that they need to do, that not all of our families have computers, not all of our families have internet connections. So the work itself has been problematic in that way. But when families do have access to that, doing their work virtually has actually made it a lot easier for some of our centers to do their work. And they found that families have been more open to having virtual meetings and trying to deal with, the bus systems or all of the different, sort of transportation and logistics barriers in place for having to do in-person meetings, court-ordered in-person visits or counseling and all that kind of thing. The other thing that that they've reported is that the systems themselves have been really open to allowing these organizations to conduct their business virtually. And that, that includes, everything from, we have oversight of parent visitations, we have drug and alcohol counseling, we have domestic violence counseling, we have, any number of things that the family court has ordered to happen that the systems are allowing to happen virtually. When I asked the centers about what kind of trends that they're seeing related to the COVID outbreak and to the shutdowns, was that they have seen, many of them have seen an increase in both in alcohol and drug related relapse cases, around CPS referrals, and a little bit of DV has been on the rise. The other issues besides technology that they've talked about is access to personal protective equipment. So masks, coming by masks has been pretty hard for some families. Having masks on hands for child welfare workers when they're out in the field, having to do some face-to-face has been an issue. And a couple of them actually said, and I thought this was interesting, that there was a lack of knowledge about the coronavirus itself. And that could be related to not watching a lot of television, not having access to technology, but that there was a real need out there for our Native families to have more education around the virus itself and what it means to have personal protection, why it's necessary, what social distancing is. So those sorts of trainings or education, a few of our centers have said was necessary. Can we go to the next slide? Next slide.
Just having a little bit of a technical difficulty here.
Oh, okay. Well, and what I'll really quickly talk about next is sort of what have been some of the solutions. So one of the things we do know is that these urban centers have decades often of having to work with very little resource to do really big work. So we know that we also know that the pandemic itself has been really problematic for Native families, because often our families are the ones that are working. So we're seeing, spikes in unemployment. We're seeing spikes in the need for rental assistance. We're seeing spikes in the need for food assistance. And obviously spikes in the need for technology, access to technology and hardware to be able to do this work. All, with no exception, all of our centers have been providing food to needy community members, and often it's coming with their mandated face-to-face meetings that they've had to have, and they're making, you know, the safe drive-up food deliveries. They're doing baby supplies. I got reports from Minneapolis in Minnesota that some of the parent reunifications have actually happened faster as a result of the shutdown, because the court systems very early on recognized that they're not going to be able to do their work the way they needed to. So with families who were really on the precipice of reunification anyway, the courts just went ahead and made that reunification happen right as the shutdown was starting. So, you know, some happy stories in there. Some of our centers are providing COVID-19 trainings for families, usually on a one-on-one basis. And then this is kind of important from the organizational standpoint of our ICWA programs, is that the county and state child welfare systems have been really amenable to changing how they're counting the encounters and the deliverables for their contracts, so that where necessary, that virtual meetings actually happen as a part of the contract now, as a part of the deliverable. So they're not being hammered on their contracts, which is paying for their staff and all of that. And every single one of our has instituted virtual client contact system, so they can get in touch with their clients virtually. The other big thing is that with the access to technology, one of the silver linings about living in America's largest cities is that we actually do have a fairly decent infrastructure for access to broadband. And so we've been, our organizations and the NUIC itself, we've been really close with charter communications and Comcast, sure that Native families are internet access, so Internet Essentials and Charter Spectrum both have low income broadband, which they offered for free for this 90 days encompassing the pandemic. And in some cases, our centers are actually providing Chromebooks and working with the school systems to provide Chromebooks for any of our students in the home. So I'll leave it at that because my time is over, but thank you all.
Okay. All right. All right. So I wanted to let everyone know that this is the time when we're going to have about 5 minutes with each of our panelists for a Q&A. So what we would ask, we have a large number of people on the call, over 260 people, is if you go to what's called the Q&A box, like it will either be at the top or the bottom of your screen. It's usually probably hiding, but if you move your arrow down there, it will come up and it should look like, it should say Q&A actually. I'm having trouble with mine, but let's see. And what you do is it's like a chat box basically, and then you can just you can type your question into there, and then we're going to read the questions to Janeen, and then she's going to respond. So we're going to have about 5 minutes for that. So go ahead and type in your questions.
I did see, David, that one of the questions earlier was on the numbers and what our source was. That's from the American Community Survey, and that's the American Indian alone and American Indian in combination numbers for the metropolitan statistical areas for the 24 cities that I referenced.
Great, thank you. Okay, all right, I'm looking for questions. I don't see any right now. Okay, wait just a little bit more. Okay, so here's some questions coming in. First question, what examples of virtual client contact systems have been implemented? Formal, informal, social media, Zoom? Maybe I think what they're looking for are some examples of what you're using or people are finding successful.
Primarily Zoom. So people are doing Zoom where possible. They're doing FaceTime. I've heard about, Facebook Messenger is being used because we know almost all of our people are on Facebook. So most of our centers, if they need to get in touch with a family, they do it on Facebook. So yeah, it's pretty much everything. But for family organization contact, it's usually Zoom or Facebook is what I've heard the most. And telephone, good old telephone calling.
Oh, yeah. Next question is, have you seen Department of Children and Family filing less petitions in court, removing children during this period?
None of our centers who I spoke with, and I spoke with about 5 different organizations working in 5 cities, have reported that. That's not to say that it's not happening. I just don't know. I can do some follow up and find out though.
Great, thank you. Third question is, regarding individual families, barriers to accessing PPE, which is, the kind of medical equipment, face masks and things like that, and technology to improve case management outcomes and stabilize families. What resources and or efforts are being made to improve access for these families?
That's been a really hard one. So these centers are generally having to raise their own funding to buy masks. I think the states and counties are slowly beginning to come up online with the provision of these types of things. But for the most part, for the PPE piece, our centers have had to buy masks. I mean, like the NUIFC, for instance, we're going to spend about $30,000 on just buying masks for our programs and for the folks living in these cities where we can. So really, it's just a matter of being able to find them at this point, which has been really difficult. On the broadband question, again, that's really been working with the sort of local broadband companies, working with the school districts to have access to the technology that the families are needing. And the centers generally are doing a lot of fundraising themselves to provide for these services and these needs for our communities.
Are you seeing states providing tribes and urban programs with PPE? It's like
No,
Matt.
not at this point. There's talk about it.
Okay.
We've heard out there, but I've not seen it yet.
One of the questions.
Maybe for tribes, not for urban programs.
Okay. One of the questions we're getting here related to that is somebody's asking, is Zoom, is it HIPAA compliant? And they said they noticed recently a local court was using Zoom for a case.
Oh. That's a really good question. I don't think it would be, because there's all these issues with Zoom being basically like spyware in your computer. So that's, I think, is an issue that's become a new reality that we're going to really have to deal with collectively around child welfare.
We're getting a lot of great questions. I'm going to ask one more, Janeen, and then we're going to move on, unfortunately. Are there online or virtual parenting classes being offered by states or others or tribes to help parents complete their requirements?
Right now, our centers are working on that. I know a couple of them are doing online parenting classes and online classes, actually even for the kids. But again, this is so new that we're only in our 60th day of this. So I think everyone was sort of took everyone about 30 days to scramble to get into a place where we could even do something that we'd never really done as a practice before. So I think our centers are just now getting to the space where they're beginning to think about what does this look like long term and how do we do this by providing classes and certifications and that kind of thing online.
Okay. Okay, well, we're going to move on. I'm just having a little bit of technical difficulty trying to advance slides. I'm going to start by introducing Angela Connor. Angela is a member of the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma. Angela got her master's degree in social work from the University of Oklahoma. She is the former vice president and president of the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association. She is the current vice president for NICWA, our organization, and she's had 20 plus years of experience working for tribal communities in human services, and currently is employed by Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma as their Director of Foster Care and Adoption. So Angela, I'm going to try and get the slide to move forward, but if in the meantime, all right, there we go. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, go ahead, Angela. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon and Halito, or greetings from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Just for clarification, I used to be the president of the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association, and now I'm a member and on their legislative committee. But I want to thank NICWA for the opportunity to come and speak to all of you about the impact of COVID on our tribal communities. My responses will be primarily from my experience with the Choctaw Nation, but also some responses will be information I've received from the 39 tribes here in Oklahoma. We have various resources like the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association, where we communicate with each other and share information. Also, my response will be from the perspective of home study director, where we work with Indian Child Welfare at Choctaw Nation and provide homes and do home studies during this time. But when the COVID first impacted the tribes in Oklahoma, as far as the Choctaw Nation, our response was to go to rotation. That way we would limit the number of staff in the offices, but would also be able to continue to provide services. So we did a 3-day rotation where you worked 3 days in the office and then you worked 3 days at home. And so we did that for quite some time until we were all sent and requested that we work virtually from home. I have spoken to some of the other tribes, and some of the tribes furloughed, and some of them went to reduced caseload as far as workers, and then some of them kept their offices open, but just a few of the people continued to work. And here in Oklahoma, you know, we have various sized tribes, so it may be a child welfare unit, may just be one person, 2 or 3. So some of the smaller tribes continued to respond to child welfare cases as they came in. So there was a variety of responses in how to continue to do this. As far as I know, all the tribal communities still responded to any referrals that did come in. And so I want to talk about some of the challenges that we face. So one of the challenges is, how do we ensure worker safety while meeting children and families' needs? And as the previous speaker said, one of the concerns is about the mask. You know, we were not issued masks, and so how did we go about doing that? And so you had to come up with various means in having that. And then there also was the issue is, were the tribal homes themselves going to have the mask? Where did you get hand sanitizer? Was it issued to you or not? Here in Oklahoma, we've had great difficulties, I'm sure, across the United States of not even having access to it in the stores. Everything was gone. So where do you get your PPEs? Where do you get your mask, your hand sanitizer? How do you go about these things? I will say that I was very fortunate that I have some great coworkers who are great seamstress and who mailed me in the mail face masks. So I know if you can see this, that here's one of my little masks that was mailed to me by Sonia Garrett. Here's another one, and I had another coworker who sent me some. So that was great to hear. I know that the Choctaw Nation now is issuing face masks. As of last week, I returned to work on a rotation where I work 3 days here, 3 days from home. And then as of June the 1st, the workers will come back on a rotation. And then June the 15th, our goal is that all staff will be back at work full time. We're going to continue to follow the social distancing and use our personal protective equipment. We've all been trained and through technology about what is required so that we can hopefully resume full duties and work with our families. Again, how do we do the worker visits? How do we facilitate visits between children and families? These are all things we had to think about. What would we do about court hearings? How would these be held in state and tribal courts? Choctaw Nation does have a very active tribal court. And then just how will service delivery be impacted overall? So I'll be addressing some of that in the rest of the presentation. So next slide. Okay. One thing we all want to talk about, and I guess it's been a saving grace, has been technology, but there's also challenges with technology. We were very fortunate at the Choctaw Nation, and I don't really know how this came about, but fortunately, about a month or so before COVID came out, all of the social workers within our division were issued laptops. And so it was just a great timing so that we all had a laptop, and we had began utilizing those out in the field, some at home and in the office. And so, I mean, that was just a blessing in disguise in some ways. But again, our technological challenges is that we are in rural Oklahoma. And as I stated, there's 39 tribes, and for Oklahoma, for the Choctaw Nation, we reside in 10 and a half of those counties, and those are very rural counties. And so in a lot of the areas, there aren't any cell towers or very few. Accessibility to the internet and Wi-Fi is just a major issue. So although we had the laptops, there was the issue as well, does our homes have laptops? Do they have internet? Do they have a cell phone? Do they have a computer? And so workers and foster families, the inaccessibility to the laptop, do they have cell phones with FaceTime? Did they have minutes on their cell phones? What about the Wi-Fi, the internet? Just for example, for me to be on this call with you today, I am using my work cell phone to hotspot in onto my laptop. I'm using my personal phone for the audio. And then while I was setting up, I got a signal that my battery was low. So it's just connections and wires everywhere. But that's a part of the reality of the technology. Solutions, as I stated, the staff were provided with laptops. We have cell phones. And during this time, we've been given lots of training and tutorials on WebEx. That was not something I was familiar with before, or Zoom, or video conferencing. So it's been a great time to get educated. So that was a challenge, but it's also become a benefit. Also, some families had or were provided with cell phones. We work very closely with our family preservation program and our domestic violence program. And so I know that our family pres program has provided some cell phones with minutes so that they could communicate with those families and provide some parenting. Someone asked earlier about parenting. I know there's been parenting provided individually and in group settings. I mean, you're making the best out of the current situation. Children have been, we FaceTime the children, we Skype, Zoom, parent conferencing, child conferencing, whatever it needs to occur. Okay, some of the innovations that we've come up with, again, with the different tribes here, I was on a call the other day with the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association and some of the other stakeholders, and there was some great discussion about the inaccessibility to Wi-Fi or broadband. And I guess there are some sites here in Oklahoma where you can get free broadband and Wi-Fi access, but I was informed that those have been shut down. So that's a problem right there in itself. One of the innovations is a lot of the tribal facilities have Wi-Fi at their facilities, like the community centers. A lot of people go and park in the parking lot so they can access Wi-Fi. We've had workers who have terrible internet connectivity who've actually driven to the parking lots of the tribal site so that they can do their work. One of the smaller tribes that I talked to said that their community had become aware that they could access Wi-Fi at the tribal facility, and they would sit literally in the doorway so they could access internet connectivity. So you see, it definitely is a problem. I know one foster family that we have that we wanted to do FaceTime with the children, and the foster parent commented, well, that she had limited minutes. So that can be a hindrance in itself. So there are a lot of barriers. There's a lot of positivities to technology, but there are a lot of barriers that we've encountered. Like I said, the interconnectivity is one of the major ones, and then just ensuring families have access. Next slide. And we were asked if we would address how is our relationship with our stakeholders. And so again, I'm talking about here in Oklahoma, but with the State Department of Human Services, the Choctaw Nation workers have been going on joint investigations. So they're actually going out in the field with DHS. We're maintaining communication by phone, email, WebEx. Some of the problems that we have seen is delays in getting back background information as they too are working from home. Their activity, their connectivity, and accessibility has been hindered. So that's caused us delay in doing our home studies when we need background information and we're not being able to get that. So in relation to the home studies, we are still getting people who want to become foster parents, or children are being taken into custody, and we're still needing to certify family for placement. So that's caused delay. It's caused children to be placed in places other than with relatives, which is disconcerting to us. However, I will say, though, on the flip side, the Department of Human Services, our tribal liaisons have really been great to respond to us by email and phone. They'll call us from their home and provide us with information. So there's been pros and cons both with our Department of Human Services. And as far as our courts, some of the courts here in Oklahoma have shut down or have postponed hearings. So naturally that has a negative impact on our families. I talked to one family the other day who had hoped to have their visitation increased with their children, but the court hearings was postponed. So in reality, they're still at a stay where they can't see their children more than they would at this point had there been a court hearing. Fortunately, in the Choctaw Nation Tribal Court, we are continuing with our court hearings. Those can be heard in person or virtually. And so if you do appear in the court hearing, I've been told that you have to have your temperature taken, mask. They limited the number of people that can come into the courtrooms to make sure that all safety measures are in place. And so they're being held in person and virtually. So we try to keep things going as much as we can. Now, as far as the service providers, it has been really hard to get drug testing. Again, so if you're wanting to increase visits or you're trying to do a referral and trying to get drug testing, those facilities and placements have been very limited. One of the things that I've seen is the counseling has been being conducted virtually or has been postponed. And so that's also a challenge to do counseling with young children. So again, it's better than nothing, but it has been reduced in the number that's available or how you can do it. Our schools are closed. I live in a very rural community, and that's been a major impact. They had to come out to my home to see if my son had a computer or had internet accessibility. Daycares have closed, which caused a huge impact on our families and a lot of added stress. We have some foster homes who are nurses, and when the daycare closed, that caused a problem because what do you do with children if they're not themselves staying at home? So we had to work with those families to arrange babysitters and child care providers. And then the question was, well, who's going to pay for this? So those have been some of the major challenges, and also some of the challenges in staff returning back to work is what child care facilities are open. One of our other great stakeholders is the Administration for Children and Families. And I would say they've been great in sending us information on a regular basis about webinars or training or updates on funding. Also NICWA, can't say enough about NICWA, how you try to keep us informed. both on the training aspect and updates of what's going on with COVID. Also, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I spoke to them last week about a funding source, and so they tried to find and provide us some guidance on funds that's available and how we can utilize that. The Child Welfare League of America has been sending out a lot of information, including the tribes, which is great to see. And so we've had a positive response in regards to stakeholders as well as some challenges. Next slide. There should be another slide, David. Okay. As far as innovations, like I said, we had a call a couple of times with the various tribes, and I'm so appreciative to the other tribes giving me input and providing ideas and suggestions. And some of the tribes have mentioned that they do what they call porch drop-off. So again, they're maintaining the social distancing, but they're providing food baskets and cleaning supplies so that the families don't have to actually go out to the stores and take the little children with them. So they thought of items they could really utilize. I did ask them about the funding sources, and so some of it's been tribal funds, some of it's been 4B1 and 2. So hats off to 4B1 and 2 who allowed us the opportunity to purchase these things. So they were porch drop-offs, and some of the food items they said was like peanut butter, Spam, non-perishables, cleaning supplies that they maybe couldn't get access to. They also mentioned that they might put a stuffed animal in there or a blanket. So those are maybe some ideas that each of you could take back with you. One of the other tribes that I spoke to said that they did hygiene backpacks. And we know backpacks are a really big thing right now with everyone, especially teenagers and kids. But the backpack had hand sanitizers, maybe a toothbrush, toothpaste, shampoo, just various things like that. So the backpack was something that the kids could use, but also had, items in there that they would appreciate. So that was a great idea. One of the ideas that I really, really loved was books that had parents' voice recordings. And I have heard that from more than one tribe, so I just really thought that was a great idea, that if a child can't see their parent, that you have these books where the parent's voice has already been pre-recorded. When they look at the book, it's as though their parent is reading the book to them. And so I think that was a really innovative way to think outside the box, and I would really encourage that. Some places had the books donated to them. I'm not really sure what the process is to do this, but I'm sure we could get more information to you on that. So voice recorded books. I talked to some of the tribes. I know for sure one of them was the Cherokee Nation, who said that they and the Choctaw Nation had mailed out children's care packages. We have some children that are in facilities and they maybe feel all alone or can't get visitors, and so they would send them care packages. And it might be games, clothing items, essential items. And we know all children, no matter what their age, they love to get something in the mail. So you might think about sending out some care packages. Some other things that we look at as far as positive outcomes, everyone now is more technologically advanced. If you started at a 0 and going to 10, you've got to be at least a 1. Hopefully you're a 7, 8, or 9, but I know that through this forced technology that we've all learned a lot. We've learned about Zoom, WebEx, Skype, FaceTime. The positive outcome is that we have proven that we can work virtually. And also I was reading a research article yesterday that said that research shows that there's actually more work productivity produced at home. And someone that questioned, well, how can that be? Well, one of the responses is that if you're commuting an hour to work each day, that's 2 hours. If you're working from home, that's 2 hours of work production you can produce. And also, we all know that there's some visiting that occurs in the office, and that's a pro and a con, but it did say that working home virtually does produce more work. Also, maintain relationship with our stakeholders. We have proven that we can do that. We can maintain relations with our stakeholders and our coworkers and with our families. And I know with working with the children, we have been able to communicate with them with technology despite COVID. When this is all through, I think that when you were making phone calls to a child before, now you might Skype or Zoom or FaceTime and actually get that actual time seeing them versus just listening to them. And so the overall positive outcome is I believe that we are more prepared for future challenges. Native people are overcomers, and we have proven that we are being able to do this. And so that's all that I really have at this time.
Thank you, Angela. Really appreciate that information, especially the fact that you have been talking with tribes throughout Oklahoma too. That really helps us bring in some new perspectives as well. So I'm gonna try and advance this slide, but we're gonna open up the Q&A right now. So we're gonna look at this and I'll take a look at see what we have here. One of the questions that we got earlier, but I'm just going to ask you, Angela, and the question is there a plan to move to create a federal level justice level instead of always working at the state level? So I think what they're asking here is, everybody's trying to do the best they can at kind of the local level, but we need a federal response, more of a federal response. And it says we had our own family juvenile justice systems per our sovereign tribe status. COVID would be completely on a different level where our sovereign status would be supreme. Do you have any comments about that, Angela?
I'm not sure really still what the question is.
I think they're just asking, are we aware of any kind of plan to create, instead of always working at the state level, more of a federal tribal response?
Well, I do think that there's information being gathered from different sources to present to the federal government that will help us, especially like I said with NICWA, Child Welfare League of America, the BIA. I think with all the information that they're gathering, that there is going to be hopefully response from the federal government in ways that will help and impact our work.
Sure. And another question is, they want to know about the 6-month dependency review. Are those being relaxed due to COVID? Do you see that in your area?
I really don't know. I do know what I have seen is that there was to be a hearing the other day on one of the cases here in Oklahoma in regards to termination of parental rights. And I was happy to hear that the judge said that he was going to continue that for another 3 months because of COVID, that he wanted to make sure that the parents had full opportunity to services and resources. And so I know that that was continued to give family more time.
Do you know if there are, in your area, do you know if there are any online parenting classes that could be open to maybe tribes and urban programs in other areas?
I do know that there are some tribes, and I could probably respond to that later if they're here in Oklahoma and want to email me, and my email will be provided. But I do know there are some tribes here in Oklahoma that are doing parenting online. I've seen where they're asking the parent, do you prefer to do it individually with just you yourself, or would you prefer to do in a group setting where they can do parenting education with more than one? So I know that that is something that is being offered, and so if they would want more information, they could email me about that.
Great. I think our next question is regarding children who have been victims of sexual exploitation. if you're working with them, what services are you offering to them during this time of COVID-19?
As to my knowledge, with the Choctaw Nation, we've not, as of during COVID, to my knowledge, we've not dealt with that. And so I can't really respond to that. I do know nationally that there has been increase in domestic violence cases, and that's concerning because we haven't seen that great a case in child welfare. So we know if there's domestic violence, that is impacting the children. And I know there are a lot of services still being provided in the area of domestic violence online and through the Choctaw Nation and many of the tribes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Angela. I think we're going to move to our next speaker now. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. Debra Avenmarg is a staff attorney with California Indian Legal Services. California Indian Legal Services is a nonprofit legal services corporation that provides California tribes, tribal organizations, and Native American individuals with no cost or low cost legal services focused on issues of Indian or tribal law. Ms. Avenmarg's primary focus in her position is advocating on behalf of tribes in child welfare cases, both in state and tribal courts. Ms. Avenmarg has extensive child welfare experience, having advocated from every legal role in child welfare matters. And prior to working for California Indian Legal Services, she provided legal representation to county child welfare agencies, parents, guardians, de facto parents, children, and other non-minor dependents. In addition to her legal experience, Ms. Avenmarg also has experience acting in non-legal roles in child welfare. She was previously a foster parent, a foster family agency staff member, and a CASA volunteer as well. So with that, I want to welcome Debra, and go ahead.
So hello, everyone. I'm going to be going into more detail around a couple of points that Janeen and Angela previously brought up, specifically with regard to changes in court hearings, technology, and active efforts. At this time, I'm seeing that a lot of courts are limiting the hearings that are being held in both tribal and state courts. They're wanting urgent matters to be heard over what they're deeming less urgent matters. Some courts may not be hearing certain types of hearings at all at this time. I'm seeing a lot of hearing dates extended out specifically for reviews rather than urgent motions. But I want everyone to know that despite this, there usually is some way to get urgent motions before the court, as long as you can mark it as an urgent motion and give the court some way to distinguish it from all the other non-urgent matters that they're sorting through. There's different ways to mark motions as urgent. One of the most common ways that I've seen is filing an order to shorten time with the motion. Basically, an order shortening time, it includes a declaration that explains the urgency and the need to get this matter on calendar immediately and have a quick hearing. It usually suggests a court date that you'd like this matter to be heard by, and it asks the court to shorten the time for notice and to set the hearing. I've also seen in some counties that they have like a local add to calendar form. That's their way of getting urgent matters on calendar immediately. Other courts have, they just want you to provide some kind of cover sheet with your motion that shows that it's urgent. But basically in these times, it's important that if you have an urgent matter, don't just file it as you normally would. You need to mark it as urgent so that the court can tell that it's urgent and make sure it gets on calendar. Otherwise, it might not be on calendar for some time. In addition to marking matters as urgent, I recommend working with the other parties in the case or building your court connections wherever you can. One example of where this has really helped in my office, me and an advocate, we were working with a client and she suddenly got notice from her work that they had pulled her background and they found some criminal history there. And the note from her work basically said that she could be terminated within 20 days unless she responded to this. So we wanted to get her criminal history expunged immediately. but the courthouse wasn't open to the public. You couldn't call the main line to the courthouse. There was no one answering that phone. Expungement matters weren't considered urgent matters. They were put off for another couple months. But my coworker working with the district attorney's office, the public defender's office, she was able to get more information about the previous charges. She was able to notify them that we would be trying to put this matter on calendar on a shortened basis as soon as possible, not waiting for a couple months when these expungement matters would typically be heard. My coworker, she also saved contact information from a court staff member that she had some previous interaction with some time ago, but she just kept that contact and she reached out to that person, and that person luckily was very willing to help us. We dropped off the motion in the court Dropbox to file. We notified the court staff member that we had dropped it off. She picked it out of the pile and she took it up to the judge right away just for us. We filed an order shortening time with our motion. We included the letter from her employer showing how important this was and that she could lose her job if we didn't get this resolved within the 20 days. We work with our public defender's office and district attorney's office, and we had huge success in this case. We got this matter on calendar within 5 court days of filing it in that Dropbox, and the expungements were granted. So huge success in a case that really wasn't a matter that courts were finding as urgent and even hearing at that time. So it's important to be a squeaky wheel when you have important matters that do need to be heard. Be proactive, reach out to the court, reach out to the other parties. If you don't have any contacts with the court, maybe other parties that you're working with do have those contacts. So work together with them. But I believe that, you know, even with limited hearings being heard, important matters can still get on calendar. Now, when you file your matters with the court, you're going to notice that courts are looking a little bit different during the pandemic. Courts are becoming more tech savvy and more accepting of the use of technology. Some courts are accepting e-filings when they didn't previously. Some courts are allowing you to file just by emailing a court staff member when they didn't previously offer this option. Courts are also more accepting of electronic signatures when they previously wanted that wet original signature. And these are good things. It's easier to file because of this, but also there's some difficulty because there's some confusion around how to file. Courts aren't always posting online the clear guides how to file during the pandemic. Sometimes you just have to be in the know, or you have to reach out to your contacts and people that appear regularly before that court and find out how to get these things before the court. And this is creating some issues. Also, you have to gain some technical skills as well, and you may need to set up some kind of e-filing account. You need to know, where the court is accepting these electronically filed documents and how to follow up on those. Another change is hearings that are occurring by phone or video conferencing typically. And telephonic and video appearances, they have some great benefits, but they also have been presenting some challenges. Attorneys and parties, they can't communicate as easily or as freely as if they were sitting next to each other in the courtroom or if they're talking in the hallway. I've been able to get by with emailing a client during a hearing or texting them if I have questions, and it's worked okay. It's still not the same as gauging reactions of someone sitting right next to you or having that in-person communication in the hallway before court. But that is one of the workarounds, is emailing and texting people during proceedings. There's also been some issues with phones or internet cutting out during court hearings. There's a lot of issues with people not muting themselves when they're not talking, or they're forgetting to unmute themselves when they do start talking. I've heard dogs barking in the background. There's been kids interrupting. There was a toilet flush during the Supreme Court oral argument even. So it's definitely more difficult to have hearings when you're over the phone or on video. It's difficult to present witnesses and evidence because of these complicating factors. Another issue I'm seeing is courtroom control. When you're in person in a courtroom, there is a bailiff there, there are attorneys sitting next to their clients. One of the cases I was on, everyone was appearing by phone in this matter. There was a very upset client on the phone. He was basically venting, talking over people. No one could get in a word, including the judge. There was no stopping this person. There was no bailiff to tell him to calm down or make him leave the courtroom. There was no attorney next to him to elbow him and say, hey, come on, settle down, let me talk for you. Instead, the judge basically just had to hang up on everyone, and then everyone had to call back in for the next proceeding. So definitely some difficulties here. Because of these issues, I'm also seeing that some counties are not actually having parties appear at hearings. It's just the attorneys appearing. And it's really unfortunate when parties aren't able to attend their own hearing. You know, these are their family matters. These are important things that are happening with their families. So that's unfortunate to see. But there have definitely been some positive sides to the use of technology in court hearings. Sometimes, I believe as Angela mentioned, or maybe it was Janeen, because of the technology, it may be easier for someone to pick up a phone or get internet access to Zoom into a court proceeding, when otherwise it'd be pretty difficult to get bus passes and, you know, to have that travel time. So we're actually seeing that parents are more likely to appear for a hearing because it is easier to access through the phone or through video. There's also less travel time for attorneys or for ICWA workers to come to court, and that could decrease the cost of court appearances for tribes. There's less time waiting around for a hearing, and if you are waiting around for a hearing, if you're at home, it's easier to work on something else when it would be more difficult if you were in person and in the court hallway. So it can be more efficient as well. The use of technology and working from home, it's affected professional appearances in court. It's important to remember that if you're appearing by video, it still is a court appearance and you should still look like you're in court. Where media has been able to attend some of these video court hearings, they're picking up on that attorneys are looking less professional, clients are looking less professional, people may be lying on a bed or relaxing on a sofa. There may be cats in the picture, dogs barking. If the media is picking up on these things, judges are definitely picking up on them too. A couple of courts that I've appeared in, they've issued notices to attorneys telling them that they still need to dress up for court. Men still need to wear ties, no t-shirts. So just remember to look like you're appearing in court when you appear in front of court, have distractions out of the way. It's much more powerful when you look professional, you're more persuasive, and it adds to your credibility, even if you're just on video from your kitchen table. Next slide, please. So now that you have some ideas about how to get your motions on calendar, some of the changes with court filings and hearings, you know how to dress, let's talk about working your cases effectively. A big problem that I'm seeing during the pandemic is there's a lack of accountability for active efforts due to COVID. There's some general idea that I'm seeing from social workers that some services can be put off until after the pandemic. And I have a sample quote here from one of my cases that basically doesn't accept credibility for the agency for the services not being available. It also looks like it's boilerplate language. One clue is that my case was a ICWA case with a standard of active efforts, and this talks about reasonable efforts, so they even got the standard incorrect. But this isn't what ICWA requires. Basically, active efforts requires a lot more. There's some federal guidance from the Children's Bureau in a letter that they wrote on March 27th. It says, there's a line in there that says, lack of or inability to access treatment or services due to provider closures during the pandemic should not be interpreted as a lack of parental compliance, but it might indicate an agency's failure to make reasonable efforts to reunify. So while the unavailability of services shouldn't count against a parent's compliance, federal guidance says it can count against an agency's efforts in the case. So I just want to stress that we can't wait on services right now. We don't know how long we'll be dealing with the pandemic or even the effects of the pandemic. Some predictions are saying that we could be dealing with the pandemic on some level for 2 years. And we can't just be waiting for some services to reopen. The pandemic is hitting our economy really hard. We may not see some of these services come back even. Timelines are very strict. They're that way for a reason. Children's bonds with their parents in the meanwhile are breaking while services are on hold. They're forming bonds with other parental figures. Children are growing up. Their childhood is not going to wait for the pandemic to end. We can't wait either. Also, if parents are getting services in their case plan, they may continue with the bad habits that they had that brought them before the court. They could get worse. We could lose all contact with them completely if they do get worse. And that's why it's not really a remedy to wait or to extend services in a proceeding. These things aren't going to fix things once the damage is already done to the families. Next slide, please. So I'd like to just refresh your memory of some of the highlights of the definition of active efforts. And basically, the definition of active efforts, it does require timely efforts. It does require assistance with accessing or developing the resources necessary. It requires identifying appropriate services, helping overcome barriers, and actively assisting parents in obtaining services to overcome these barriers. It requires considering alternative ways to address the needs of Indian parents and, where appropriate, the family if optimum services do not exist or are not available. So it's like the definition of active efforts was actually written with the pandemic in mind. You know, with the pandemic, parents are facing barriers. Their optimum in-person services are no longer available in many instances. Active efforts requires child welfare agencies to consider alternative ways to meet parents' needs, and it must be done in a timely manner. You can't wait for the pandemic to end. You can't just say services aren't available anymore, too bad. I understand that social workers are already overworked, and unfortunately during the pandemic, social workers are just they're gonna have to work even harder. They're gonna have to come up with new services, new ways to meet case plan objectives. And I think it's important to remember that the purpose of case plans isn't just to comply with services that are outlined for the parents. The purpose of case plans is to get behavioral changes from parents. And it doesn't necessarily take going to a service, attending a class to get behavioral changes. We need to think outside of the box and think of other ways to get parents there. These standard programs just aren't available at this time often during the pandemic. So think of other things that parents can at least work towards getting towards their goal, even if they're not optimum. It could be reading a book about certain things. It could be connecting them to certain groups and individuals, maybe offering additional therapy online or through the phone where they can discuss domestic violence or substance abuse. It could be attending 90 online AA meetings in 90 days, getting a sponsor and working the 12 steps and going through that process. There may be some oversight issues if everything's done online. But honestly, I think there have always been oversight issues in these cases. For instance, parents used to have their AA-NA cards, signed at meetings. I've seen those faked in my day. It's going to take some trusting of parents. They can keep a log of all the services they're doing, when they attend those AA meetings, what time the meetings were, what the group was, and just keep a log of that for the social worker. There are ways around, there are ways to show that they're attending these services. And basically, social workers can talk to parents. They can quiz them about what they've learned. They can ask them how they're using these skills in their everyday life. It doesn't have to be the standard classroom participation. There's other ways to get these skills as well. It's just going to take a lot of creativity from everyone, people reaching out to their connections, finding out what's worked in other cases with other tribes. But it is possible for active efforts to be provided during the pandemic, and families still can reunify during the pandemic. Can I get the next slide, please? For more information on how to get your cases back on track with active efforts during the pandemic, on the California Indian Legal Services website, there's a resource here that you can click on and read through to give you some ideas. And do I have any questions at this time?
Hi, we're running a little bit behind. So Deborah, I think what we're going to do is we're going to let Julie speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up again at the end, and then we'll take questions for both you and Julie.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so our last panelist is Julie Taylor, member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And Julie is the great-granddaughter of the late Chief Clarence Burke and the granddaughter of the late Ellen Burke Kawapoo and William Bill Johnson, and daughter of Marlene Taylor. She is a mother of 2 children, Jacqueline and Sydney Jones, and grandmother of 1, Brooklyn Jones. Julie has a master's of social work degree from Portland State University, and she's also had the opportunity for a year internship with NICWA and was employed by the Northwest Indian Health Board as well. Julie has served on the Confederated Tribes Umatilla Indian Reservation Board of Trustees, and she resigned from her position as a member of as trustee to serve as a director of the Department of Children and Family Services, where she oversees several different programs. So with that, I want to introduce Julie, and thank you for being here. Go ahead, Julie.
Okay, now am I on?
There you go.
Okay, sorry. Okay, that took up my 10 minutes. Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. I'm from the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, as David stated, and I just wanted to share with you that the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation was also in a crisis before the pandemic started. In February, we also had a flood, and I'm sure many of you probably had floods in your area or your tribes. And so I just wanted to share with you about the emergency response operations. And I'm only sharing this with you prior only because it helps within the job that we have daily to do with our children and families. So in order for the tribes to be able to have emergency response operations, because we're supposed to know where all our children are within, foster families, or where they're at within childcare provider situations. So with the tribes, we provided an emergency response operation where it was for an incident command team to come together. So in February, we already had that established where we looked at our emergency response operations that we had for our flooding and for our families to have knowledge of where we were in that stage. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that if you have one, I encourage you to look into your emergency response operations and to be able to identify and be transparent to your families in your community. As far as like it was kind of like a multidisciplinary team that you gather together, and then you make, you have to make decisions and responses and have a lot of decision making. And that includes your community and your tribe, to come together. So we had our health and education and our child welfare, our business entities, had a say in that emergency operation plan. So again, we had a lot of mental health issues and trauma that was with our tribal families and communities already before the pandemic started. So you can go to the next slide. As far as everybody was saying, the COVID-19, it did spike a lot of increased substance abuse. The kids were acting out because there was no school. The schools were closed. We did have an increase in crime and domestic violence, and as well as child abuse. And so we had limited, access to resources within our community, and also some racial discrimination that was happening within our community. Not really with the floods, but more with the COVID-19. And then you can go to the next slide. That might have a show. So when we had our first case of COVID-19 occurring within our tribal casino, it was a person from a neighboring community. It was a non-native community. believed that it was our tribal people had the virus in our area. So we were kind of experiencing discrimination as a result of that. So we had to really work with our neighboring casino or neighboring communities and businesses because they didn't want to serve our Native people. So we were kind of going back into that historical trauma phase, you know, with our people and even our kids, because even schools weren't out at that time. So they were even being told, oh, it's those Native people, you know, they're causing this virus. They're bringing this virus to us, you know, and the tribes had to create another public service announcement to educate the neighboring communities and correcting that misinformation, you know, that the virus is a threat to all communities and it's not about race. So we were having to go back and re-educate and re-inform everybody about what this virus was. And that's what others were speaking about, you know, what is this virus? So we had to go back with our public health entities and really work with them to increase the knowledge of what is COVID-19. So we planned a tribal health. We worked with our tribal health clinic, like I said, to educate the communities and provide wraparound services to our command team even, you know, to make sure that they had knowledge, and they were a multidisciplinary team. And we had to get guidelines and protocols established in conjunction with the tribe and the state and the counties. And, you know, it did change, like everybody's saying, it drastically changed how we functioned at work, how we functioned at home, our school, you know, and our social lives. And that social isolation and the physical distance is not, you know, it's not a norm for our tribal communities and families. So we really had to adapt to this COVID-19. So as far as, you know, becoming at the public health had to be the forefront to our clinical staff. You know, it was really something that they had to look at data to make informed decisions regarding our elders, since they were our most vulnerable. And they said that's what it affected most was the elders. So we really had to look at data and how we were going to react to work with our children, families, and the vulnerable of the elders, because now they're saying, you know, it affects children. So now we really have to look at ways of the pertinent data that's going to help us to make better informed decisions. And our tribal leadership and the incident team worked together, you know, to focus on this health crisis. And we had to make tough economic decisions for our community, like shutting down the casinos, like all of you probably have in your tribes as well, and how it's impacting our governmental services. So we had to establish community regulations, which was the hardest one was the funerals, was also the sweats and the longhouse activities, along with any church services. So those were really hard hit on our community as far as like, even for our foster families, as far as like having sweats, because some of our foster families do provide sweats, and you know, they can no longer provide that in their community as far as, oh, you can come sweat with your family. Today it is open to a small, you know, group of people that could sweat, but at that time it was hard to, you know, not want to sweat, but that was our way. But we had to follow the regulations that the tribe had established, and it was good. Everybody listened. We don't have any COVID-19 cases, so we hit it hard at the beginning, and it was hard for funerals because people couldn't come together for funerals or even celebrations, you know, at the Longhouse for any type of namings, you know, that the kids have, or any things that they wanted to be at church for, like our Sunday services when they did their song and dance. That was not being able to, we weren't able to pursue that as far as, you know, teachings or learning. So we did work with the education department to provide language, you know, on CDs or singing on CDs to be able to give those out to our children and families. Again, with the schools and childcare after school programs and recreation activities were all closed. So we were trying to work with our health department to figure out ways, how can we help our children understand these impacts? And so they were able to bring out, you know, brochures, or being able to get them in a way with the schools to work on like jump ropes or coloring books or things like that, or like others were saying, you know, how to read a book, stay at home, you know, and some of them, like I said, are, you know, technology, they have their phones, Facebook, to be able to have that communication. And many of our parents were on administrative leave, working from home or furloughed or unemployed. So that had an impact on kids being home all day. So of course you knew that the people needed food because usually they're in school all day. So the food was kind of, you know, they were having a hard time of trying to, okay, we got to make a meal. And so we had the health clinic provide, you know, meal recipes or things like that, that they could cook for their kids during their days at their home all day, or recreational activities. What can they do with the kids all day? And then some of them even had a hard time of, you know, trying to find tutors because not always, a lot of them, you know, weren't able to do some of the schoolwork that were, you know, that was on the computers or Google that they had, or knowing the computer or technologies. So we had to find, you know, make sure they had somebody there to help them, assist them with learning. Again, and again, with the physical, social isolation, that was a lot hard for the kids too, to be able to have knowledge of what did this mean. And so, I mean, it took some time for the kids to figure that out as far as knowing what is physical distancing. Again, like others were saying, you know, we were able to access technology, laptops, and provide food emergency assistance for tribal members, and being able to work with the tribe to get that out to tribal members. We've had about 3 food distributions, you know, to assist with our, not only our foster families, but also the community as in part. So I think we've served, you know, probably 1,200 people within the last 2 or 3 months here. So you can go to the next. Or is he gone, or David?
Yeah, it's just we're having a lot of Zoom use today, so there's
Oh yeah,
it's just a little slow.
I think it's the last one anyway. But I mean, as far as like someone was asking the questions, as far as like tribal courts, our courts are still, we're operating through virtual learning or virtual, and so we've been still being able to do our MINOCs and turning them in and making sure we're still complying with Title 4E. And as far as the sexual exploitation, we still have a guardian care center that we work with in regards to our forensic interviews, and we've still been able to access that facility. And we just been encouraging all our families to be, you know, ask for help, because many people don't want to ask for help, especially the ones that were home furloughed or unemployed. They, you know, they have to humble themselves to ask for help because they're not used to asking for help to get utilities, food. You know, some of them have rent, and so the tribe really worked with people to, you know, to work with their rent, and also with the state of Oregon, you know, where they were having their governor's plan where they don't turn off, you know, they don't turn off their water, you know, their utilities. They still have to pay it at some point, but it wasn't going to be shut off. And also communicating to them that they could call to make, you know, other plans with their companies, so things wouldn't be shut off during this time with their utilities. So really trying to work with the families to know that it's okay to ask for help at this during these times. So I didn't know if did I have more time, or do we have more questions? Or
I think what we're going to do now, I think we've got through your slides, but what we're going to do is we're only a couple minutes away from the end of our panel. But what I wanted to do is to just take a few questions. And here, now we were planning on 15 minutes here, but we're going to take a little bit. We might go over a little bit. So if you have to go, we completely understand, but we wanted to try and see if we could get a couple questions in here. So here's one of the questions that we had. It says, and this, I think this is a question for Angela actually, it said, how are the books with parents' voices produced? Please unmute all of our panelists, please.
Okay, if you can hear me, that's a good question. I'm not sure exactly how, and again, if you want to email me, I can get that information for you. One of our managers for Indian Child Welfare, she was telling me that they did do that. And then I know another tribe here in Oklahoma shared that they had did that. So I know there is a way to do it. One of the tribes said the books were donated, but then they took the parent's voice and recorded it. I know I've seen that done at Hallmark before. But again, if you want to privately email me, or I can get that information to David, he can send it out. But I know there is a way it can be done. And there was a good response from it.
Thank you, Angela. Here's another question that we have here. It says, I'm finding that many Native families benefit from traditional grassroots services. If the county doesn't approve these services, but the tribe does, how do we make that happen to benefit these families, especially in times like these? I think that this question could go to any one of our panelists. So I'll let you decide who would like to answer that.
So I'll jump in here because I don't see anyone else answering. You know, I think that really goes to active efforts issue. I think the county and the tribe really need to work together around the services that are provided to families in ICWA cases. And I think if the county just keeps vetoing these services and ideas that the tribe has, I think there's really an active efforts issue there. And I think, you know, that may be something that you want to file some kind of motion to get put on calendar and get court approval to modify the case plan that way. And take care of sooner rather than later. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Deborah. Here's a question. It says, has face-to-face contacts between children and parents begun to resume? And if so, what suggestions do you have to increase the number of in-person visits while maintaining optimal safety precautions for all? Angela or Julie?
Well, I know with our tribe, some face-to-face has resumed, and the question we've had is, do both parties feel comfortable? Our Indian child welfare workers, you know, they ask the questionnaire, you know, have you been out of the state? Are you healthy? Have anyone in your home been sick? And so if they pass that part, then we ask the foster family or the biological family, are you comfortable with having a face-to-face visit? And if they are, then some has resumed. Also, some of the face-to-face visits are occurring like in the park. So where there's, you know, more ample space between parties. So that's what we've done so far.
Thanks, Angela. This is a question asking about some of those faster reunifications, I think, that we heard Janeen talking about a little earlier. It says, are there any particular parameters put in place that led to faster reunification outcomes?
I'll take that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't have my earphone in. So the center that I talked with was in Minnesota, and the reason those came the reason those came about was that the families were already really on the precipice of reunification anyway. So the Hennepin County Court decided at that time that since this was going to happen anyway, that they were able to move it forward. And again, that happened right as the courts were beginning to shut down. So I don't know if that's an option for other reunification processes in other counties or other states across the country, or other tribal courts for that matter at this point, because I still don't think courts are still in session regularly for reunification efforts, is my understanding. I don't even know if that answered your question, but that's all I know.
Thanks, Janeen. I think this is going to be our last question. This is a question for Debra. And the question here is, kind of jumping around here. What barriers have you experienced in state and tribal courts in presenting cases and communicating the tribe's interests? How have you addressed these barriers?
This is a little vague. Is this specific to during COVID or?
I think it is during COVID, yeah. With some of the things that you've already shared with our audience, I think they're asking if there are some additional barriers to try and express the tribe's interest, probably in state court is my guess.
You know, I think the important thing is just to always be there and participating in these hearings, whether they're virtual or by phone, and just, you know, the tribe is another party in the proceeding. You know, they have a right to participate in, you know, everything that's being discussed in the proceeding, and just having someone stand up in court and expressing the tribe's position on everything, you know, just having that regular contact in court and having the judge see that the tribe is interested in this case and present on the case. And, you know, also when the tribe's position's not being honored, or if the county's not working with the tribe, then getting motions before the court so that the court is aware that there is an issue here, and so it can be dealt with sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm sorry, I want to apologize to everybody in the audience. I've had some difficulty, a little bit clunky trying to get slides to promote, and so I just promoted this last slide. I know we had a couple people who asked, how do we get their contact information for all of our panelists? And I also want to point out this, the heart over here, the graphic. This is something that Julie Taylor sent us earlier, and so I want to give her credit for that, but I think it really sort of depicts how we're feeling. Despite all of the challenges right now that we're all experiencing because of COVID-19, there's still a lot of love and compassion in our hearts, and a lot of hope and work to try and support healing of the trauma that our children and families have experienced. So again, I want to say thank you to everybody. Remind you that this has been recorded. It's going to be on our website, NICWA website. It's going to be on our COVID-19 page, and so you'll be able to see all of this information later after we post it. So again, thank you very much for supporting NICWA. Thank you for attending our workshops, and I hope that your rest of your week goes well.
Thanks, David. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.